Check, 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 check. Please check your registration cards. This is Bonham Sanctuary for the Town Hall meeting for the 2019 Church Transformation Consultation. Now, next fall, you'll have a lot of these town hall meetings because there will be something called the general election going on. And, well, it ought to be done. Well, it ought to be done by this time next fall, right? We will elect a president on November the 3rd, 4th, something like that. So strike that from the record, but we're going to warm up for next fall's town hall meetings. Now, the purpose of this time, and thank you all for coming out. I mean, we thought maybe we would have 6 people here tonight because of the inclement weather, but you hardy Midwesterners can get out here. So thank you for coming. You have probably heard of Dr. Paul Borden. He is going to lead our town hall meeting tonight. He was with session and staff all day on Saturday from 9 until 2, and then with session after that. We have also had him in our service at 10 yesterday, if you were here. Hope you were. By the way, that training that Dr. Borden did will be online tomorrow. So you can take it in bite-sized chunks. It's about 5 hours, and it's incredibly inspiring about seeing what God has done through churches who desire to transform. So I would really encourage you to avail yourself to the training that Dr. Borden did with staff and session on Saturday. So without wasting any more of your time, I'm going to reintroduce you to the man, the guru, the church health specialist, and our eco representative who's worked with a lot of eco churches, I think close to 30 now. And I'm in a cohort with other pastors that we were meeting in, of all places, Newark, New Jersey on December the 5th and 6th. Why not Orlando, Florida? I don't know, but we're in Newark, okay? So we'll stay in the Embassy Suites. Dr. Borden, welcome. Let's give him a welcome from Bonham. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Okay, this one, I get this mic. You're going to do the mic. Okay. Thank you. Again, I want to thank you. I wasn't sure what was going to happen tonight, so I'm delighted that you're here. I never know how long these are going to take. I'm going to allot an hour, and if for some reason you don't get your question to ask, if we go a whole hour, I will stay afterwards and be glad to interact with you if you have questions. 2 ground rules that I work with all churches is if your questions or comments, whatever you want to make, if you could limit them to 2 minutes so that everyone who wants to ask a question will have time. I figure in 2 minutes you can at least ask 2 questions, or if you want to make a comment. And then if you made a comment or asked a question, I ask that you not ask any other questions until everyone has had a chance to respond, so that everyone, hopefully, that wants to ask something gets a chance to do that. So, and by the way, there were some that have been emailed in. I'm going to take those first, so that'll kind of get the ball rolling anyway, because it's always the first 2 minutes, everybody's sitting there waiting for something to happen. So I'll deal with a few that are here. So I'm going to lead in the word of prayer, and then we will start. Our gracious God, we thank you tonight for your grace, for your goodness. We thank you for this congregation and for what you are doing in the hearts of the people here. I am grateful for the work of your Spirit and for how you want to energize us to be your servants to accomplish your mission in this world. So I ask for your guidance and direction in this time together, because we need your help. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. The first question was, what exactly was the question posed to Dr. Borden to engage in this study? I'm not going to read all the rest of it, but this all came about as churches were moving into eco, and eco recognized that as churches came into this new denomination, they had all made a big step, obviously leaving most of them PCUSA, coming into eco, making a commitment to Scripture, but most of the congregations that were coming in were not growing. They were not healthy. In fact, many of them are in plateau or decline, and if you've been to the national gathering, that's the majority of eco churches. And as Dana Allen has said, your denominational leader, we're not here just to change denominational jerseys. We are here to create flourishing congregations. And so when pastors and churches join the cohort, this whole consultation process is part of the whole commitment that is made by the church and by the pastor when they come in. So that's why I'm here, because your pastor is in this cohort, and all the churches, this is the third cohort. There's been 27, we've done 3 cohorts, there's been a total of 27 churches, and all 27 churches now have gone through this process. Has the church leadership examined a list of past churches I have worked with? And that's a good question, because I think that should always be asked. But every year at the national gathering, we have a report from some of the pastors. We have a report from even a whole seminar where pastors come in where this has happened, that people can interact with them and talk to them. So I'm assuming that some of your leaders that were at the national gathering did that. But that happens, and ECO is open. And I'm open when people say, what's happened, for people to do that, because I think that question should be asked. Does Dr. Borden have any success in large metro areas? Says, all my stories from little towns. Well, I probably wasn't clear, but QandA is right in the middle of Sydney, Australia, so that's a pretty big city. I know it with at least the leaders on Saturday. I think I said it yesterday, but I talked about the day of prayer. I talked about a church in Queens that we had worked with, which is a pretty big city. There's one Presbyterian church I have done 3 consultations with every 10 years, and it is Central Presbyterian Church in Baltimore, Maryland, right in the middle of the heart of the city of Baltimore. So, yes, I have worked with small churches, large churches, rural churches. I worked with an eco church literally in Williamsport, Pennsylvania last year, that when I got within a half a mile of the church, my GPS just said help. I mean, that's how bad it was in terms of finding the place. Another question is, what about the focus on schools? And the person raises the question about the political issue with, the ACLU and philosophies and all of that kind of thing. One of the things we have found is, and this is why I worded the prescription the way I did, when schools go in there to serve, and that is their agenda, it may take 1 year, it may take 2 years, it may take 3 years, but the more you serve, the more then schools begin to open up to say, would you come and help us with this? Would you help us with that? And it's amazing the doors God opens. Our churches, which are in for the most of them, were in Northern California, the best thing that happened from a mission perspective was 2008. Because when the bottom dropped out of the economy, that affected tax dollars, it affected school events. And when you would go in and serve the school, they say, hey, can you give us other help? So one pastor, church, a high school, he would always call the principal about every couple months, 2 or 3 months, say, how can we help? And it was like April. And this would have been about 2014, whatever, something like that. And he said, is there anything I can help you with? He said, you won't believe this, but all our dry erase boards in the school, we have no more markers. They're all gone, and we have no money left in the budget to buy markers. And the pastor said, okay. He said, I went down to Staples, bought 3 great big boxes of markers, took it into the school, and he said, you would have thought I was Moses leading the children of Israel into the promised land. Okay. And they have all kinds of relationship with that school. So that's why you go in to serve and let the school then invite you to have more areas of influence. If children's church meets only at 11, would that be problematic for parents who want to attend the traditional service? Well, it might be. I mean, if they want to stay and go to the other service or have their children there, that might be. But here's what's the thinking behind that. Churches like yours, which are all the eco churches for the most part, that are in plateau or in decline, you do need to do some things now that you would hope you can do better and with greater effectiveness later. So when I come to a church like yours and I think through the prescriptions, the metaphor I use is triage. You know, when there's an emergency and you got all these people to take care of, you have to prioritize and say, what needs to be addressed first? Now, if you want to reach people who don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ, in our culture, they are not going to give you 2 hours. They are only going to give you 1 hour on a Sunday morning. So if you want to reach them, with children being the key factor in attempting to reach them, you have to understand that they're not going to come to Sunday school. and church. So you got to make a choice which you want. And the advantage of having it at the 11 o'clock hour is then you have a service that they can be in, as opposed to say, well, if you come to Sunday school, they might go to the traditional worship, but most younger people are not going to be related to the styles of music that are there. Some will be, but many of them will not be. So I take it you must have a follow-up question? Yeah, so could we do an adult Bible study or Sunday school? Oh, sure. Well, if you want something for the Christians, that's fine. Okay, but recognize that's not going to help you get the target you want. But the other question that comes into play, and this relates to another question that's here, is in terms of the children's issue, not only do you need as much in terms of financial resources, you need a lot of terms in human resources, as well as the energy that goes with that, and you don't want to disperse that if you don't have enough resources. If you have enough resources, then that's fine to go ahead and do that. So I appreciate the clarification. Well, right now I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You're right. We're going to do that. We have a mic, and but thank you. I appreciate the comment. Another question that came about is, because our church is in a neighborhood of mostly older adults, how can we reach children? And one of the things that I like to remind people is the automobile is here to stay. And there is very seldom, in some areas of the country, Chicago and some others may, but for the most part, there are not community churches. Most people do not go to church necessarily in the community in which they live. And also, if there aren't schools here, there are other elementary schools that you just kind of begin to focus out on to say, how do we reach people in different communities? I would guess, if you're typical of most churches, the average person who drives here on Sunday drives a minimum of 5 miles. That's somewhere between 4 and 5 miles is true for most churches, unless you live in Oklahoma City. Then it gets to be about 8 or 9 miles at that point. So that's what we are saying in terms of the community. Then, a couple other questions, and then we'll start to take the ones that you have. Will child care be available for the full day of prayer? I sure hope so, because if you want people to participate, you have to make sure that if they're going to be here for the time of prayer, to go out and drive the community, to come back and see what God has done, you need to have child care. In fact, some eco-churches that have been close to each other, or if a church has had a relationship with another church that's not necessarily eco, but they have a relationship with another church, pastors have called up and said, would you be willing this Sunday, because we have this special day going, would you come over and serve us by taking care of our children? And they have worked that way, which is really how churches should be functioning anyway, so that they can serve the kingdom that way. But yes, that is crucial if you decide that you want to do this and have the day of prayer. I think that pretty much, the other question here is related. Now, Phil has a mic. He's going to play Dr. Phil or whoever. I know that's not, it's Oprah, I guess it is, isn't it? Dr. Phil would work. I hadn't thought about that one. So if you have a question, raise your hand. He's going to bring you the mic, because we are recording this.
Thank you. I'm reading here, and it says the pastor will lead the staff in session, completing the mission ministry audit of every ministry, and I think the rest of us can read the rest of that. And I know that we're trying to grow the church, but there are some ministries we support, like Freedom School, where the people from North City come to Olivet, or usually have the teachers pick up their kids and take them to school, that aren't going to contribute to the growth of this church. Neither is El Centro in Central America, neither is the orphanage in Russia.
Okay.
Are those ministries going to be held to the same standard of growing the church?
Okay. No, and then I should have been clear. What I'm talking about are the traditional ministries that you have here as part of your church. So here's what I'm talking about. The choir, the worship team, the session, small groups, Sunday school classes, women's ministries, men's ministries, those ministries that are part of the life of this congregation that happen week after week after week, those are the ones that I'm talking about. Because I recognize when you go out to do mission, you're out there, from my perspective, building the kingdom of God. But the question is the church, which is to grow, Jesus said, I will build my church, are we conducting the ministries that are often for the Christian in a way that helps each ministry do the Great Commission? So I should have been clear about that. Thank you. If you're going to say something, we need to have it on mic. No, that's fine.
Okay, something that Paul shared with us, Dr. Borden shared with us in some of our session meetings, is one way that you can do it with missions is inviting a guest, someone who doesn't know the Lord or somebody like that, to come along on a mission trip. Because what a great life-altering type trip where you can really experience what God is doing.
Yeah. In fact, often, many of our churches in California, after they turned around, the policy was that if you were doing a mission trip, particularly if it was a work trip, where, say, you're going to build an orphanage or you're going to help them put up a church building or whatever, that 1/4 to 1/3 of the team needed to be people who didn't know Jesus. Because they can lay cinder block just as well as the Christians can, and they have to sit there every night while you share your testimonies. It's a wonderful way to do evangelism at that point. So that's what we were talking about. So that's what Jeff is referring to. All right? Who else has a question? Hand here, and then we have one in the back. Phil.
Cypress is closer, Dave. Sorry.
You talked about most, if not all, committees going away, and
Yeah.
so I wonder what that means to the current deacons as opposed to the elders and staff.
Okay. What does that mean to the deacons? And by the way, different eco-churches have handled this differently. So what I would like to suggest is, from my perspective, the ideal. Okay. But deacons, other churches have handled that in a different way. In most Presbyterian congregations, most eco congregations, the deacons do what you all call community care. Do a lot of visitation, hospitals, shut-ins, that kind of thing. That the deacons then, in essence, become the care team that is under the pastor who's in charge of community care, so that you have a team. Now, your deacons have done a little bit differently, so you might have to divide people who are currently deacons up under different staff members to be part of their ministry team. But that's really how most of the eco congregations have handled that. Okay? Hand in the back.
Having served as an elder on 2 different occasions, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of our antiquated structure. But could you flesh that out a little better in terms of how do we function today, and how would that look in the future?
Okay, the way you function today is that often, and like most of the Presbyterian churches, is that for every ministry there's an elder or maybe a couple of elders that are related to that staff person, and that there's oversight in regard to how that ministry is done, how it's conducted. In fact, as I was interviewing a couple staff, they were saying, I find that if I wanted to go the ministry this way, sometimes the elders or the deacons who've been working with me on that ministry, they think it should be another way. So you have this division sometimes of how to do it. So in the new model, the pastor, the senior pastor, in this case Phil, is responsible for big goals related to your mission statement. So with the mission statement that's there, for example, this might be an example of what some of the big goals are. How many people are going to come to Jesus this year in the life of our church? How many leaders are going to be developed this year in the life of our church? What are we going to do in specifically related to discipleship, the starting of new groups, the getting people involved in Alpha or whatever it is? And maybe the fourth one, because of the nature of this church, is what are we going to be doing outside in the different neighborhoods, and how's that going to be handled? Now, staff members will be over all of these areas. They have to set goals for their areas. They are responsible to, it is the senior pastor's responsibility to hold them accountable. It is the session's responsibility to take these big picture goals and say, all right, let's suppose in each ministry, I'm saying this for simplistic illustration, every staff member says, I want to see 5 new people come to Jesus. You add them all up. Phil says, I want to see if I can lead 5 people to Jesus this year, and maybe the evangelistic goal for the year is 75. That becomes the church goal, which in essence is the senior pastor's goal. and he is held accountable for that. He is then holding each staff member accountable for how have you met your goals. So that's one of the major differences, so that the person who's responsible for that goal under that ministry, you have responsibility, is also given adequate authority. It's up to them to figure out how to get that done. But they are held accountable, and there is either an honoring or a not honoring of how well they have done in relationship to that goal. Yeah, follow-up question. Well, yeah.
I still am not sure I understand what the session's real role is. I get goal setting and fills and
Right.
all of that part, but I'm not sure I'm still grasping
Well,
what the
okay,
session really
all right.
does.
The session's responsibility, from my perspective, is to make sure that every year at the end of the year, they can come back to the congregation and say, this is our mission, this is how much of it we have accomplished this year. This is our vision. This is what we have accomplished this year. Now, the other thing that I think, as a result of this, often in our churches, our sessions, or the equivalent of what we had sessions, would only meet 4 times a year, because they didn't have to be involved, because the running of the church was done at staff meeting, not in the session meetings. Now, they still have fiduciary responsibilities and that kind of thing. But many of our sessions or boards took the position, for the most part, we're not going to talk about anything in the board meeting that's going to happen in the next 6 months. We see ourselves as a dream team, saying that as we grow, if we're going to go to another service, how do we do it? Let's think through the issues, etc. If we're going to have to raise more money, or if we're going to say we want to put a campus in that part of the community to reach that part of the community. So they become the dream team that is looking forward much more than the day-to-day or month-to-month ongoing of business. That's the goal. Okay? All right, have a hand up here.
In our conversations with you during this week, you had used terminology like staff and contemporary, and you have a different definition than what I think the majority of us view as staff and contemporary.
Okay.
Would you explain that?
Yes, okay. When I use, and I thank you for doing that, because I said I would do it on Sunday and I forgot in the process. So I appreciate that very much. When we use the word staff in our churches in Northern California, we wanted to communicate to the congregation that the word staff had nothing to do with money. That the word staff was the marriage of 3 terms, and you've heard me say those. What's my responsibility? Do I have authority to carry out that responsibility? So rather than say, all right, here's the youth pastor who has to report to the youth committee. The youth pastor has a responsibility. For young people, the youth committee tells them when he can get the key to the van. Okay, that's what we're talking about. I have authority. But if all you do is marry authority and responsibility, that's a problem. So is there also accountability? So when we did our turnaround, most of our churches didn't have the number of people you had. As you heard me yesterday, I mean, we had churches of 50, 60 people. They used to be 500, and often they had a transition or an interim pastor. And one of the first churches we saw turn around, if you want to check, was First Baptist Church of Napa. Now, you're Presbyterians. You know where Napa is. That's the wine country, okay? Baptists don't admit to knowing it, but Presbyterians know it. When we moved them to this model, that first year, they had an interim pastor and 12 staff members. All staff were volunteers. But every staff member was very clear about what their responsibility was. Every staff member had authority. So if you were in charge of children, you picked the curriculum. You selected the teachers. You trained them. But at the end of the year, you were accountable. Is the children's ministry growing? If not, you cannot stay in that position. Is the children's ministry seeing children come to Jesus? If not, you can't be in that position. Are you developing leaders? Because if you don't develop leaders, the ministry is not going to grow. This even allows you to fire volunteers. I'm serious, because we were serious about the Great Commission. Now, today, even so, many of these churches are 400, 500, 600. When the staff meets on a Tuesday or Thursday, whenever, sitting around that staff meeting are full-time staff, part-time staff, and volunteer staff. But all of them are clear. I have a responsibility. I've been given adequate authority to carry out that responsibility, but I will be held accountable. So what I used to tell our churches, I said, the full-time and part-time staff, you're paid to be good. The volunteers are good for nothing. Okay, because they're not being paid, but they're still being held accountable. So thank you for that. That's what I mean when I use the word staff. Okay? Hand up here, Phil. And then, okay, we'll get to you. No, we're recording this. That's why okay.
Yes. Could you define a few more words?
Pardon?
Define a few more words
Sure,
or terms.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
You refer to a prayer drive.
Yeah.
What is that exactly?
What is a prayer drive?
Uh-huh.
I'll give you a couple examples. I work with a church in Butte, Montana, church of about 180, plateaued. So when the day was over, the day of worship was over, everybody was given an assignment. And I think most of them, like the board members, you will take these 4 people in your car. You'll take the other person, you'll take these 5 people in your car. And you're to go out and drive the community. You will go here, you will go here, you will go here. And when you get there, you need to be praying for the people who are there. Praying that Spirit will work, that perhaps God will open doors of opportunity for your church to have a relationship with them, to help, to say, can you help us figure out even how to strategize to reach them? So they had a number of seniors in the church, and they rented one of these really wonderful vans, big van. All the seniors that were in there, and they went about a half mile down the church, and you could see 3 house trailers just sitting there. And the van turned and pulled in, and instead of stopping, they went over the bluff. And when you got over the bluff, there were over 100 house trailers that nobody knew were there because you couldn't see them. And God, at that point, broke the hearts of those seniors, some of them crying to say, we never knew those people were there. God, help us figure out how to reach them. The Eco Church up in Rome, Pennsylvania, one of the people who were driving went up to the school with a car full of people, the high school, drove around the high school, stopped at every doorway, said this is where the science and the math people are. They began to pray for those teachers. They began to pray that God would help them figure out how to reach that school. Went to the next door and went to every door around there. So that's what we mean by a prayer drive. Now, in highly metro areas, we actually have people prayer walk. So that's what I mean by that.
I guess I'm still confused. I mean, we get in our car, we have a plan of
You have
where
a
we're
plan,
going.
and you intentionally pray primarily for people who do not know Jesus.
Okay. You made a couple references to things that lead to gospel presentations.
Yes.
What are they?
Gospel presentation. Let me describe for you what I mean, and I want to go back to the word evangelism. I find that the word evangelism, when I use it today, most people think of a tactic. So it would be, do I take someone to a Billy Graham crusade? Now, you can't do that today because Billy Graham died, but do I take somebody to a Billy Graham crusade? Do I go knock on the door and do evangelism explosion? Say, if you were to die tonight, go to heaven, etc. Now, those are gospel presentations, okay? But to me, what I want to say, because I think we do evangelism differently in 2019. The gospel never changes, but how you communicate to people is different. So here's what I mean by a gospel presentation. We say, give someone enough information that they know they have a need with God. Jesus has met that need in what he did on the cross. And this person has a responsibility to decide how they want to react to what Jesus did in their behalf. And then you invite them to respond. When you have done that, from my perspective, you have made a gospel presentation. Okay? All right, so we need to go on some, thank you for the questions. Now, this is a gentleman who had his hand up before, Phil? I'm sorry.
Is our structure typical? When I say structure, I believe we have 13 elders and 33 deacons. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that number's changed in the last few years.
Close. That's close.
Is that typical of a church, or is that?
That's very typical of churches. Now, like our churches in California, which were not Presbyterian, but they were down to 50. They still, most of them had about 12 to 15 committees and 3 boards. Okay, and as I said, you act as though Jesus said you can come that you might meet. Because people spent most of their times in meetings not doing the ministry. And that's what we wanted to try to begin to change. Okay? Now, you had a hand up back there? Yes.
Yes, I have a question that had to do mostly with the proposal to change the schedule of the services. And when I saw that, the observation or the thought I had is that how does that make sense along with the goal of growing the church? It seems like if we reduce the number of services from 3 down to 2, I sort of would, in my mind, draw the analogy of if I was running a store and wanting more customers, I wouldn't close my store for part of the day. In other words, we have fewer opportunities to attend worship. How does that make sense with the goal of increasing our congregation? That's just one basic observation. The other one is that the timing, I guess, would have to change in terms of the adult Sunday school classes, the adult classes, because they occur at the same time as the proposed traditional service, and it would, of course, preclude anyone from attending the both of them.
Right.
And so those were my main comments and observations.
All right, let me respond by saying the church I was involved in for 11 years in Denver, we had 11 services, so I believe in multiple services. But I also recognize that in your service, as I said yesterday, in both of the traditional services, you do not have critical mass. And so if I want to go back to a business metaphor, today it's for me like walking in a mall that's declining. I really have no desire to go to that mall. If I'm going to go shopping, basically I want to go where there's the sense that there's things are happening and moving. So when visitors come in, you give them 2 options, but they're both bad options. And so the point was to come together. So in our church, when we would start a new worship service, and we at one time went from 1 service to 2 services to 3 services to eventually 11 services. Every time we started a new service, whatever size that room was, we wanted enough people there on a Sunday morning or a Saturday night or whenever we started it, that room was minimally 50% full, preferably 60% full. And so when we started a new service, there were some people who wanted to go to that service, but generally it was never enough to actually fill that service more than 50% full. So we would go to people in other services and said, for 6 months or a year, would you go to your service but then act like a missionary and go sit in this service so we have critical mass? We also started a nursery and a children's ministry every time we started a new service because we understood that if that doesn't happen, that service isn't going to grow. So here's my hope, is that within a year, you can go back to 2 traditional services, maybe have 2 contemporary services if you're growing, but right now, the way your services are structured and the way they are conducted, I believe works against you for growth because of those reasons. Okay, Phil?
Just a comment about the 9:45 Sunday school. I don't think it changes at all because we still have an 8:30 service. We still have an 11 o'clock service, so that hour in between, the only thing that changes is kids' church. Children's ministry will meet during the 11 o'clock contemporary service. So I think Sunday school classes, if I'm understanding, stay there at this point.
If you move the traditional service to 9:30, it means that if there are people who want to go to Sunday school, which, by the way, from what I've been told by a number of people here, you don't have that many people going to Sunday school. I mean, it's not like this is a major value, and I also, in the summer, you take off anyway. So, I mean, it's not like it's a major value of the church at that point. So all I'm saying is maximize what you're doing to get the advantage out of it. And those who go, if there are Sunday school services 9:30, they can now be held 11 o'clock. You've got plenty of room so that while the contemporary service is going on, the Sunday school classes can still be held in this church and not affect anything in terms of messing up what is happening in that service. We need it on mic. Who's the next? Yes, sir.
Yeah, real quick, and just to maybe back you up, I was involved in a church plant back when I lived in Florida. And we had a big auditorium, and we filled it up with chairs, and we got excited that we were going to build this church, and we struggled out of the gate. And the most important thing that we did was take chairs away. And it was hard because it's a big step of faith. We were saying, okay, now we're only going to have 35 chairs until we filled up those 35 chairs, and then we put in more chairs. And it got to where every week we were adding more chairs. But to exactly your point, if you're coming in from outside and the room is empty, you don't make it into the chair. Okay. And that's one of the problems with pews is you can't take them away, so you have to pack them fuller.
Yeah, and hear me well, I'm not recommending this, but from my perspective, pews are the most foolish things churches have done because you take your nicest, biggest room and make it unusable for most other things. So it's interesting to me the last 2 times we've been in Europe how many of the cathedrals you walk in today do not have pews, but they have chairs. So a question up here, Phil.
Actually, I'll hold my question until later, but I do have a comment about the 11 o'clock service, just as we're thinking and praying about this, is that in some respects our 11 o'clock service is really a service to a lot of our widows. And so that's my big concern, and if we choose to do without that, is that really is servicing a group of women that, we're supposed to care for the widows and orphans, and that really is servicing that group right now. So we'll have to pray about, is there a different solution to that if we go to just a 9:30 service?
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, who's next? Hand over here.
So I have a couple of questions about embracing technology. What ways does ECO see that going, especially with millennials, Gen Z, having a complete dependence, and also having a basic distrust for participating in large institutions? And the second part is
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
So the embracing technology,
Yeah.
you said. So how do you see, or how does ECO see that happening, especially with, millennials, Gen Z, who have a complete dependence on technology and don't trust large institutions?
Okay.
And then part 2, are you guys making any investments in that area for like cloud technology to help?
I didn't understand. I'm sorry, I didn't
So
understand.
are you making any investments with ECO for like cloud technology to help with those trends?
I'm not sure. Let me answer the second question first. I'm not sure what ECO is doing intentionally to design that. But I just have been, in the last month or so, listening to probably the church that is growing the most, at least that I know of. It's a mega church of 3,000 or 4,000 people. They are reaching millennials, and they are reaching Generation Z, and their average age every year is declining, unlike most churches whose average age is increasing. And they say, so for example, in their church, while you're driving to church, you can order whatever kind of cappuccino coffee you want. It's ready for you when you get there. You register your children so when they show up, the armbands are all ready. That's there. They recognize that those people in those generations, the first place they go to look about the church is the website. And generally, you've got 15 to 25 seconds to decide whether they're going to look at the rest of your website. So those are now, they've got the money, they've got the resources, but that's the target. So the group, and by the way, they are very high expectation church. They are clear about the gospel. The pastor preaches regularly on the topics that caused many of the churches to leave PCUSA. And yet there are people, let's take the one that's most, the gay area. There are people there who are in that background who are not yet coming to Jesus, and they hear the pastor say what the Bible says about it and believes it, but yet they are reaching out to them, they are loving them, and they're seeing them come to Jesus. So the higher the expectations are for people who come in this day and age, the more that church grows. Okay? All right? Who's next?
I read somewhere where churches have adopted a local mission, whatever the cause is, and used it as a tool that they advertise in the local community to bring in new people, want to help out at, Oasis or wherever, and have used that as advertised it and used it as a tool. Do you have any experience with that?
I can give you an excellent illustration. If there's one thing I'm 75, us old people have in common, if we're Christians, with millennials and Generation Z, is we all should care about causes. And the main thing that touches millennials and Generation Z are causes. There's a mega church that I actually preach at fairly regularly. I train some of their staff in preaching and that kind of thing. That church is turning around, by the way. They had plateaued and declined. They had gone from about 5,000 down to 35,000. Or 3,500, excuse me, 3,500. They're now back over 4,000. And by the way, here's their vision: 700,000 gospel presentations here, near, and far in the next 7 years. And they're seeing so many gospel presentations, they're now raising it to 1 million gospel presentations. 2 years ago, when they do Christmas services, they're in a part of the country where you do Christmas services on Christmas Day, and that Sunday, they get probably 2,000 or 3,000 more people there. The pastor said, we worked for months planning, talking, how we could get people who are new to the church fill out a visitor's card. Okay, now, their deal was, if you had a visitor card, they would say to everybody else, put your card in the offering plate. If you're a guest, bring your card to the information table, and we will exchange your card for a coffee card. Christmas came, 7 services, they did not get 1 card. So the next year, this last Christmas, on Sunday morning, they had, because through their missionaries, they had worked out a relationship with missionaries who were ministering to the largest brothel in India. And the whole Sunday, Christmas Eve, Christmas service was on the issues around women trafficking. They took up 2 offerings: offering for the church, offering for the mission, for working with them. But here's what they said: if you're a guest here today, would you fill out the card? And if you bring the card to the information desk, we will donate $5 in your name to that mission. That Christmas, they got 250 cards. So they would do it for a $5 donation. They would not do it to get a free coffee card. Okay, because that reflects this whole idea of cause. And so if and by the way, there's talk about redoing your website. The first thing they should see on the website is what's our mission? What's our cause? When I turned to your website, I saw your buildings and I was impressed. I really was. I mean, you got wonderful facilities, but that's the wrong thing to have on the first page. Okay, it needs to be about a cause. It needs to be about mission, because that's what we're about. And so calling the church back to mission and talking about that mission. And, one of the things that I'm impressed with that I'm guessing your pastor has led this is we got to be telling our stories. Those stories need to be on that front page of the website. So that there's the idea, hey, you come here, we're about a cause. Okay, it's not about us, but it's about the cause. So yes, that's very crucial. Okay? Hand up over here.
Yesterday you mentioned some of the steps that we would be taking if we went this route. And I know in our session discussions we talked about trying to train. And after yesterday's service, I had a number of people that I was talking to out in Stephen Hall lobby saying, well, I'm not an evangelist. I don't know how to go out and evangelize. What is this thing he's talking about as far as this net thing?
Right.
Can you give us a little bit more lay level description of the kind of training you're talking about that ECO and the staff, that ECO is going to provide the staff, and they're going to provide the lay leaders and that kind of stuff.
Okay, all right. Let me first of all give a story that's centered around eco churches. Last year, through the second cohort, I was doing church consultations all during the year for that second cohort. 3 weeks in a row, because one time I did five of these weekends in a row, 3 weekends in a row, as I was talking to the session and the staff on Saturday in the day of training about we need to be called back to sharing the gospel. We talk about the dying of churches in the U.S. What's worse is the dying of the whole concept of doing the Great Commission. I mean, that's just gone by the wayside because most evangelical churches have replaced doing ministry with doing evangelism. Now, you need to do both, okay? And in front of their peers, 3 session members, one each week, raised their hand and in essence said this: Paul, I know I should share the gospel, but I don't because I'm scared and I don't know how. And so one of the things I began to work on is to say, it's one thing to say you should do this, but it's another thing to say, how do we do it? So I told the story about 3 years ago. I was working for about 2 years with Nazarene District of Churches in southwest Missouri. Carthage, Joplin. I've been to Neosho. Okay, you talk about the end of the world, but I've been there, okay? Now, if some of you live there, I'll talk more slowly. No, I'm kidding, all right. Okay, but, I've been there, okay. And on a series of occasions, I would go out to a meal with a pastor from the First Nazarene Church of Carthage. Church of about 350, 400, which in that part of this country, of the state, is a big church. And every time I was with him, we would sit down, they'd bring us a menu, and when the wait person would come over to take our drink order, he would introduce himself and he would say, by the way, I'm the pastor of the Carthage Church, and when you bring me my food, I'm going to thank God for it. That's what I do. And when I'm doing that, is there anything I can pray for you for? And every time I was with him, no matter how busy that wait person was, they'd say, well, would you pray for this, or would you pray for this, or would you pray for this? I began to, as I talked to other pastors, they said, oh yeah, he's telling us as other pastors, we have to do this all the time. In fact, Paul, you don't know this because I didn't do a consultation with that church, but he said, if you're on the board, the session, you have to do it every time you go out to eat. That's a requirement to be on the session. So about 6 months later, I was in North Carolina with a church about your size. And I was sharing with the leaders on Saturday. And I told that story. And the next morning, I got to church early, and they were going to have 2 services, so I got there, it was about 7:30. And the pastors and some of the people were just kind of, around, I think the first started about 8:30, whatever it was. And an assistant staff member came to me and said, Paul, stay right here. And he went over, he got an older gentleman across from him. He literally had him by the arm and brought him over. He said, tell Paul what happened this morning. He said, Paul, I get here early to help the pastors, anything they need on Sunday morning. He said, so I get here about 7 o'clock. The church was kind of out in the country, even though it was a big church, and when you drove by there, you knew it was a church. And he said, 2 miles down the road, there's a convenience store. I stop there every Sunday morning for coffee because, honestly, their coffee is better than the church coffee. Okay, so he says, I stop there for coffee. He said, I go in there because it's out in the country. Nobody's ever there at 7 o'clock in the morning. He said, I went in there this morning, got my coffee, went out, got in the car, and was literally going to put my key in the ignition. And I remembered your story. So I got out of my car. I walked back in. There were 2 women behind the counter. One was kind of in the back. One was right by the counter. And he said to the first woman, he said, I don't know if you recognize me. I'm here every Sunday buying coffee because I go to the church down there. When I go down there today, is there anything I can pray for you for? And the lady said, nah. And the other woman said, what'd you say? He repeated it. She said, oh, would you pray for this? Would you pray for this? Would you pray for this? And then the other one said, well, if you're going to pray for her, pray for me. And when he told me this, he had the biggest smile on his face because he knew every Sunday now when he went back and those women were there, he was starting to develop a relationship that at some point could lead to a gospel presentation. So I said to this pastor at the Carthage church, what happens when you do this? He said, every second, fifth, eighth time, as I leave the restaurant, that wait person comes over and says, thanks for praying for me. I'm having some things in my life. Can I pray with you? He says, I'll meet with them 2 or 3 times, but it's during that time that I actually sit down and share the gospel. And it's stories like that we need to know. So that's why there's those 2 training pieces in the prescriptions, not just for the elders, not just for the staff, but hopefully people, all of you, to come and say, we know we are supposed to share the gospel, but how do we do it in culturally relevant ways? Now, what I mean by net fishing is how do we do sharing the gospel together? So, when our churches would ask, a third or a quarter of this mission team has to be unchurched. Many of our churches were involved with Habitat. If you wanted to be on the Habitat team, you had to get an unchurched person to take a week off and help you with Habitat. And if you couldn't be on the Habitat team. Because most of us don't know non-Christians in any way. And if we do, we don't have those kinds of relationships with them. And you spend a week building a house together, you develop relationships. And so the purpose of the training, which is what that's what we're trying to help churches do. And it's amazing the stories I'm hearing coming out of eco congregations. That church in Williamsport, I was with the pastor about, 3 months ago. And they said, this year we've already seen, this is a church of, they haven't even broken the 200 barrier. I think they're about 150, 160. They said, we've already seen over 35 people make a profession to follow Jesus this year. And the pastor's sky high. The session is sky high. And by the way, then that's what you share. These are the kinds of things you share at your annual meeting. In fact, I had one of our pastors say, our teenagers like to come to the annual meeting because it's all about what did we accomplish. Not how many dinners we had, not how many things we went on, not how many meetings we had, but what have we seen accomplished. So that's what we're trying to do. And I took a little bit more extra time for that. We still have time for questions, but I think that's a crucial area. So thanks for the question.
Hi. 2 things that stood out to me in your prescriptions yesterday were, first of all, the fact that most new people who come to church will only give you an hour,
right?
Which I'm seeing that absolutely is true, but that also we need to go about making friends.
Right.
If people are only giving you an hour and you're devoting that hour to a worship service, how do you segue into making friends? What are these churches doing to add on to that service to build the friendships?
What they are doing, and by the way, I've already recommended the staff, so I didn't put it in the report, a book called Fusion, written by Nelson Searcy, who has a large church in New York City. When people walk in, ideally, here's the idea. There should be a team out there in the parking lot helping. Okay, and I know churches in the middle of winter, they have people out there at that juncture. When people walk in, they need to know they will be greeted and treated in a way that honors them where they are. So, for example, I went to a conference at it was a church plant that was now 10 years old. They had 2,000 or 3,000 people coming. And I heard that all their greeters were trained to read body language. And so they're doing a conference, and they got everybody out there and all the balloons. You ever been to a conference? So I said, I'm going to test this. So the first day of the conference, I walked in. I said, hey, hi, people are talking to me. How you doing? How's it going? Etc. The next morning, I deliberately got out of my car, went, and most people left me alone. They were reading my body language, okay? So a good greeting process is a matter of mass customization. People want to be recognized, but here's the issue. People are looking for friends. Now, I did a whole thing on Saturday. It's on the training with Legos. And all of us are like Legos. You play with Legos by connecting them. And if you've been in this church 5 years, 10 years, your Lego of friends is full. You can't have more friends. So that from the time people come in, your goal is to help them, as if they will let you, help them learn to meet other new people. Because as far as the church is concerned, their Lego is empty. And they can still connect because they're all new people because they don't know a lot of people in this church. And again, it doesn't mean they don't connect with you because you're mean people. You're very nice people, but you can only have so many friends, so many sustained relationships. You can be friendly to a lot more people. But by the way, the friendlier your church is, if I walk in, I'm looking for a friend and I don't have any friends, the lonelier I feel. And we have learned that if you can help people make friends within a month or two, they will stay. So, when I was in Australia some years ago, I was in Perth, and I met a church planner who in about 5 years, the church had started from a handful of people to over 1,000. He was now planning another church, and they were only 2 or 3 years into it. They already had 200 or 300 people coming. Here's how he did it. When they started that first church with the launch team, he said, now here's what's going to happen on Sunday. As I meet all the new people, and make sure I meet new people. People in the church have to realize if you come every Sunday that if I don't talk to you because I'm with new people, call me during the weeks because this is the only day I can see them. I need to be with new people. He said, when you see, I'm going to new people and say, hey, you're new this Sunday. I can't this week, but next week if you come back, I'd like to take you to lunch. And often people say, oh, okay, you know. Now, during that week, he'd go get one of his team. He said, now, I want you to follow me around next Sunday. And when you see me talk to this person, I kind of give you the high sign. You interrupt. And you say, I hear you're going to lunch with the pastor this week. That's right. He says, if you come back next week, I'd like to take you to lunch. And then he would go the next week and train somebody to say, I hear you're going to lunch with so-and-so. Can you go to lunch with me next week? He said, we would take people to lunch at least 6 weeks in a row. Now, we would take other people. We'd often, hopefully, have 2 or 3 couples or singles with us because while we sat at lunch, we understood that part of our job was to help them to get to know each other because they had empty Legos and they could still connect. So that's what we're saying, and there are systems, churches doing this, and at this point, that's why your church, from my perspective, needs to go learn from other churches that are already doing it. Okay? All right? We still have time for some more questions. Anybody else? Anybody else that hasn't asked a question? Yes.
You mentioned seeing some improvement in a year.
Doing what now?
You mentioned seeing improvements, some healthier church, growth in a year. Is that realistic in terms of being able to implement a plan like this and get it all on paper and, I don't know, outline all these
good question
goals?
Okay. First of all, let me respond this way. I have seen churches that have grown significantly in the first year. I have seen churches that have lost a number of people in the first year and the second year really take off. Okay. There will be losses. There's always loss whenever you begin to function differently. And only God grows the church. But the ability of the church to grow is important in proportion to prayer, tying everything to the vision and mission, making the person who's not the regular attender the primary focus of the church in terms of guests and how we structure ourselves, and sharing the gospel. And God does that in different ways. So yes, I have seen churches that have done really well in the first year. I've seen some churches who have had a number of losses in the first year, but then have recovered. So, one of the first eco churches I worked with, Middle Press, near Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania. Church was started in 1772. Their pastor was the first ordained pastor to cross the Alleghenies on horseback with a girl in front and a girl in back. His wife is on horseback with a girl in front and a girl in back. And they crossed the Alleghenies and they started this church. In the 50s, in the middle of nowhere, because middle Pennsylvania, I can just say, it's in the middle of nowhere, okay, but middle Pennsylvania. They had at least 300 people. I mean, when they had VBS, the pastor had to almost move out of the manse because all the rooms were being used and all this kind of stuff. When we got there 2.5 years ago, the church was down to 35 people, and 15 of them wanted the church to be a historic landmark, make No changes. The pastor, 65-year-old dynamo lady leader, who had spent most of her life as a youth pastor, had never been a pastor before, became a pastor at 60. For 5 years, she loved on those people. And when I went there, she said, Paul, I want to go for it. I said, I'm getting near the end of my ministry. I don't have time to wait around. Okay, so, by the time we got done, this church had gotten rid of their pews, if you can imagine, 1772. Okay, you talk about the 7 last words of the church. Okay, I want to say their Christian Ed room, which was basically a long room next to the church because they didn't have any room. On Sunday, nobody went in there during Sunday school because that's where the older ladies sat and drank coffee. It is now looks like the most progressive children's area you can have for what you can do in that space. They have now, in the worship service now, they have chairs and tables. And by the way, the seniors now sit at all the tables. In fact, the younger people, if the seniors walk in, they get up and give the seniors the chairs around the table because they love the tables. Have coffee on there, whatever. That church today is running 65. And it's growing, even though 15 to 20 people left and did not leave well. But in this case, it's taken a year and a half to 2 years to begin to see that growth because of all the resistance to it. In other churches where there is little resistance from the congregation, often that's when the church begins to grow. So I hope that answers the question, okay? Somebody else? Yes, over here and there.
Are you recommending that we get rid of Sunday school altogether? And if that's a yes, would there be Sunday school still for our older kids, like middle school, high school kids?
I'm not saying get rid of Sunday school altogether. What I'm saying from a triage perspective, you need now to put your eggs in the basket of what happens at 11 o'clock on Sunday. If the day comes where you can do multiple Sunday schools and whatever, because hopefully the people you're going to come are going to come to Jesus, they're going to have kids, you're going to have more children, whatever. Or the other side of it is also churches are beginning to think, how can we do things with children during the week, not just on Sunday, that it doesn't have to be Sunday school. Sunday schools are only less than 300 years old, so they weren't around for a long time, and they were started in London basically to teach kids to read. And they said, well, gee, we got them reading, let's teach them from the Bible, maybe they'll come to Jesus. So I'm not against Sunday school. All I'm saying is if that is the key tradition now and it hinders your ability to put the eggs into the basket of 11 o'clock, then I think you need to focus on that so that when you grow, you can do all kinds of things and go back to some of the things you may be giving up now because you have more people to do it. But to do it in a way that fits where we are today, that's all I'm trying to say. Okay? All right, we have a hand, okay? Okay. And then Phil, when we get done, this lady right here, okay?
I want to clarify a little bit, Kathy, about was your question about children or adult Sunday school. Because with a 9:30 service, one of the things we learned in our training was one of the things that killed churches was having that growth hour sandwiched in. And with a 9:30 service, that doesn't mean adults couldn't have an 8:30 Sunday school or an 8 o'clock Sunday school or an 11 o'clock Sunday school. It's just not a growth hour.
Yeah.
And then the idea is to put the kids, the resources and volunteers for the kids at 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean there can't be a 9:30, 9:45 Kingdom Parents class and then go into an 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
But I just don't want you to think there is no Sunday school because that's not the case. It just, there's a little bit more variety on when it could be.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Up here, Phil. And we'll have time for about 2 more questions.
At the end of the report, it says that Session's going to evaluate and study it and determine whether they decide to embrace.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 questions. One, can they decide piecemeal certain ones that they want to embrace, or do they embrace the whole thing?
Everything or not nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everything or nothing.
Right.
And this may be a question for Phil or for Session. I've been on session, so I know they meet once a month. How would you all determine what you're going to do? Are you going to have more meetings than just the one in November and the one in December? I'm just,
Well,
what kind
let me
of
tell you
evaluation and study are you guys?
If I may, let me tell you what I have suggested to session, not about session meetings. That's,
right.
So Phil may want to answer that, but I've said we're having a town meeting now. I would encourage session to have smaller town meetings where people can come over the next month or two and ask questions, raise them, whatever the issues are, talk about issues, so that people have a sense of being able to share where they are, what they think, what they believe at that point. And part of that is because with all the different ministries around here, I've heard a lot about how some things, slide through the cracks. And I hear that in every church, by the way. So this is, at least as you move into this busy season of year, I'm encourage them to spend time listening to the congregation before they decide whatever. Now, the other thing is I always write any date by such and such, so if they want to do that earlier, they can, but that's why we have done it that way. So I don't know whether, Phil, you want to respond in terms of session meetings.
Yeah, today we gathered some of our staff, and we're looking at having 3 focus groups here, at each about 3 weeks apart through January, to have what Paul described again as maybe smaller focus groups, but times that we can flesh out even more what's been talked about tonight and what you've read in your consultation report and prescription. So 3 times that we've got some dates. I don't want to say them now just to make sure we're covered calendar-wise, but those are on the docket to have you to talk more and to flesh out more.
All right, I said time for 2 more questions, then we'll be done. One over here. And then we'll go back to this gentleman. But let this lady ask her question first, please.
Okay, as I've been reading this over, it seems to me that the focus is on bringing people to Jesus. But I don't see anything for then how do we help them grow in Jesus, because it feels to me like they're brought to Jesus and then we leave them, we move on to the next person. So how do we address helping them mature in their relationship?
Okay. In the material that I gave on Saturday, and there's I did not deal with it, but there is a process in there related to beginning an intentional area of discipleship. As I look at most churches across the United States, I find most churches, I'm talking about Bible-believing churches, do not do 2 things. They do not describe what a disciple of Jesus looks like in 2019. It's a different world in which we live. People work more time. People have commute times. There's all different kinds of demands. So what's expected there? And number 2, whatever that goal is, what's the pathway from the time the first person comes into church, the first time they come to church, they have an encounter with Jesus Christ, how do you move them into it? So the connection system I've talked about of getting people connected eventually needs to relate to the idea that once you come into our parking lot, we're going to work with you until you are, here's the key word, mobilized. Not till you're a covenant member. Because that's why 20% of the people do 80% of the work, because we bug them till they become members and we leave them alone. The goal of doing all of this is mobilization. So there is the process of that, but at this point, again, I'm coming back from a triage perspective to say we've got to get started so there are people coming in to disciple at that point. Okay? Last question.
It's not a question, but a statement of concern. I'm not sure how many years ago, 4 or 5 maybe, Dana Allen conducted an extensive survey, opinion survey, interviewed a number of couples in the community, in the church, talked to all the staff, all the session, and then filed a report similar to what you did. And it was a whitewash, quite frankly, because I know and talked to many people who were very candid about the concerns they had at the time.
Okay.
So my concern, quite frankly, is Dana the right guy if that's going to be his approach? Because in my opinion, that congregational coach, I think you call it, needs to be somebody who's going to really ride herd on the church and on Phil.
Okay.
And so it's a concern of mine. Hopefully, it's no reason to be concerned. But if past behavior is indicative of future performance, then I do have a concern.
All I will say in response to that, Dana is the overall coach, but there's no way he can be involved in the life of the church like other coaches are. And your pastor has already engaged another coach who's going to be much more walking with him week by week, month by month to do that. That's already, and Phil jumped on that and said he's going to do that. And I know that you think you had a conversation today, I assume. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say in response to that. Okay. I want to thank you for coming. The thing that impresses me most about eco congregations is in these town meetings, you're really nice. Thank you for being nice. I appreciate that. I mean, your questions, your concerns, you handled them well. So my prayer is that God takes what you stand with a great history, great tradition, and you stand on some pretty great shoulders. But the question is, what's going to be here 5, 10 years from now because of what you have done, what the session has done, what the staff has done, what the pastors have done. That's really what we've got to answer for. So I was going to close in prayer unless there's something else, Phil, that you want to say.
Just a quick announcement. Dr. Borden, we voted on this as a session last night. There's a screwdriver underneath your pew, and everyone on the end is going to be expected to just pick it up, and there's a semi out the back for you. I'm kidding. You can pray. Okay. Keep the pews for tonight, I guess.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me close in prayer. Our God, I thank you for tonight, for the fact that on a night like this, so many people are here, not only because of their love for this church, but of their love for you. I've sensed as I've talked to many that there are a number of people here that want to see this congregation reach out with even greater effectiveness into this community and all the segments of this community to see people become brand new disciples of yours. So I ask your blessing on this congregation. I ask your blessing on the leaders, on the session, the deacons, those who are serving in other capacities, for the staff, both the support staff, the ministerial staff, for the pastors, and for the senior pastor, that this church may experience your anointing, because only you grow the church. May this church experience your blessing of growth, not for the sake of numbers, but for the sake of discipleship, and to be obedient to Jesus, and ultimately to bring honor and glory to your name. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. You're dismissed.